The Book of Numbers. This fourth book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised to Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness. And immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the Promised Land. Now, you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion, and they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the Promised Land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab, and the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling, but up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness. That's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
Okay, with that, we, like I said, have been able to see what is a very good outline and overlay of the book of Numbers. We could go through our same basics that we start with each book. We talk about the author, the date, and where it fits in the timeline, and it's given perspective both in English and in Hebrew. The author attributed to this is the same as it has been. It's still the authorship of Moses. The date exists somewhere around the same time period, about 1444 to 1406. Again, you can round that to 1450 to 1400. There's no shame in that. We're still trying to put it in that same period. It fits in the same timeline as we've been established so far, and I think our study on Sunday morning has helped us in this. We're all about the same time from the leaving of Egypt and the journeying in the wilderness. They have trying to get to the promised land, and at this point with the book of Numbers, this is where a lot of the shifting happens about their the wandering, and that's why in Hebrew, this book is literally titled "In the Wilderness" or "In the Desert," and because I put both of those translations there, wilderness and desert, because when we think wilderness, we think pine woods, right? It's not the barren deserts with few oases and rocky cliffs, because that's something that's also, I think, a little underknown about this region is the amount of mountains, rocks, cliffs, and the difference of elevation amongst the topography. I'm trying to say all these words correctly. The difference in elevation amongst the topography of this region. There's a lot of mountains, there's a lot of valleys, there's a lot of cliff sides, and these oases that they find are few and far between. They're pools of water hidden up. It's not our cartoon mindset oasis, a big pool of water surrounded by green, lush palm trees. No, sometimes it's just a small, babbling brook that exists simply because of a rainy season. So they're in this wilderness. That's the perspective of the book of Numbers. So all of that kind of answers our first two questions. When did these events occur? What is the name for this book, which gives us greater emphasis? Let's, to address the English name, you see this on the slide. The English name comes from the two different censuses that take place in this book, one in chapter 1 at Mount Sinai and one in chapter 26 on the plains of Moab. So why do we call it the book of Numbers? Because it kind of starts and sort of ends. We go to chapter 31 in the book of Numbers, but chapter 1, chapter 26, for what it's worth, that's what they decided in the ancient times to call this book the book of Numbers, because it was the book of Israel being numbered. And that does kind of make sense when that's the very beginning of the book. But this is where we get to our outline. And the outline will slow us down a little bit, take us through some of deeper thoughts, some of these different verses that we'll stop and look at, and we'll be able to address some of our questions on here. That said, let's just begin at the top. Numbers can be separated into 3 major and 2 minor units. So it's kind of a juxtaposition, and you see that on your map. You saw that on that initial screen where you have a large section in the front with a few like caveat chapters, if you may call them that, and then you have a large section in the middle with a couple more caveat chapters, and then you have a large section at the end. And so I chose in our study to break it up into these 3 major units and then 2 smaller minor units in the middle. I want to reiterate, as I do every time, these outlines are arbitrary and are simply used to help you understand the content of the book. You can redefine it how you feel fit to see it in a better light. But let's start with major unit 1. That is the preparation at Mount Sinai. The preparation at Mount Sinai. Now we're coming out of the book of Leviticus, which was when they received the law, and we have that comparison with the book of Numbers. They're leaving that moment, and you have that on your page too, with the Exodus, the covenant Sinai, the covenant being broken right after it was received, and then Leviticus was all pointing to the law and how it was designed to point to the Messiah. We talked about how Leviticus makes an arrowhead. It makes what we refer to as a chiasm, and it all points to the Day of Atonement. The focal point of Leviticus was the Day of Atonement in which God would redeem his people. So we're leaving Leviticus and we're coming into the book of Numbers, and in chapters 1 through 4, you have this first census being taken. And it takes up the entire first 4 chapters. There's a lot of, if you like numbers like I do, and I'm not talking about the book, I'm talking about like the digits. If you like math, you're going to love the first 4 chapters of the book of Numbers because it's a lot of biblical math, and you learn some about these families, the dynamic in which they exist, the strength that some of them have, the weakness that some of them have, and you just see it played out in just the amount. But it also lets you gain perspective off of just how many people we're talking about. Just how many people that are needing to be fed, just how many people that have animals, just how many people live in this society that is nomadic, that are moving from place to place to place, and they're having to keep track. Why do you think now food is a concern? You read those numbers, you learn why water is a concern. When you're trying to provide water for that many thousands of people, you have to have this supply. So as they're nomadically traveling through a place with no provision, and fully relying on a God to provide, it really begins to illuminate just understanding how many folks we're dealing with. We're not talking about a church. We're talking about a minor nation that is moving about. And chapters 1 through 4 really grant you and give you perspective on that if you go through and read there. You might want to skip them, and I understand. You say, this is hard to get through in one waking session. Stand up while you read. Get you an audio Bible. I'm not sugarcoating it. Yeah, I get that it can be difficult to read. And this nation had this many, and this son had this many sons, and this son had that many sons. I know. But it's important. It's supplied for a reason. It helps build context just with who we're dealing with. And then the second half of the first major unit, which is now comprising a third of this book, is all concerning the Levites and the law of the Levites. It's concerning the Levites and the law of the Levites. Remember, the Levites were the 13th tribe that was set aside. They did not have physical possessions like the other 12 tribes had. They were to be supplied by the other tribes. They were the ones who were supposed to deal with the maintenance of the literal material that comprised the tabernacle. When it was time to move, they were the ones packing it up, putting it on their animals, and moving it to the next area. When God stopped them, they would sit down, they would reset up the tabernacle. They were in charge of the physical materials that comprised the mobile tabernacle of Israel. Not all of them were priests. We'll get to that later on in this book. It was already referenced in our video. But they were definitely in charge of the interior part of Israel. You see that with their camp layout. The tabernacle was at the center. They were to be focused on the supply of the tabernacle, the physical parts of the tabernacle, and were used by the priests for the labor of the tabernacle. But in chapters 5 through 10, the Lord defines what the responsibilities of these individuals would be, and there's a lot. Again, it's 5 chapters of this whole book, and so or 6 chapters actually. So go through. You can read that too. You can understand more about how they were to apply themselves. And don't get me wrong, you may read something and go, "This sounds weird. This doesn't sound like anything we would do today." And understandably so, that's not our culture. We're reading about a completely different culture. But when you read those laws and you say, why they're trying to be so different? Why are they being so unique? What was the purpose of, not doing this or not doing that? It was to stand out. It was to showcase a difference, because the Levites were to be an example to the rest of the nation. They were to be set apart and different, saying, look, I am living in servitude to God, and that forces me to look different than the world around me. This was just an internal picture of an internal picture of an internal picture. We had Moses and Aaron being the image of God to the priest. You had the priest being the image of God to the Levites. You had the Levites being the image of God to the rest of the nation. And you had the rest of the nation that was all collectively supposed to be the image of God to every neighboring country, community, and civilization. So it was just an internal example of an internal example of an internal example. It ultimately started with Moses and Aaron. They're way back in the book of Exodus chapter 3, and it continued outwardly through the priests, through the Levites, and through the nation of Israel. And so it was just trying to be an example to the examples. Some major verses that you could really focus on in chapter 1, verses 47 through 51, and this is going to be in a list. You don't have it on your papers right now because I gave you the first half of the questions. We're not going to go past those because I'm still working on the last 10 chapters questions, and that's why you don't have it. But you'll have these next week. But verses 47 through 51 of chapter 1, the Levites are entrusted with the responsibility of the tabernacle. I want you to know that I'm not just making that up. That's where it's located, right there at the end of chapter 1. The Levites are entrusted with the responsibility of the tabernacle. In chapter 5, verse 5 and 6, the Lord defines sin guilt for Israel to Moses. So he's really defining the need for these offerings. He's defining the reasons why offerings were to be in place. He's defining the responsibility then to make sacrifices because there was an acknowledgement of sin creating this chasm, creating this problem between humanity and God. Chapter 6, verses 22 through 27, you have the blessing of the children of Israel by the Lord through the priests. And this was a very unique blessing. I think Brother Joel can bring it up for us if he wants. Leviticus 6, 22 through 27. We'll read that all together. Yeah. I did say that right. Yeah. All right. The priest from among the sons of Aaron, who is anointed to succeed him, shall offer it. It shall be a perpetual statute to the Lord. It shall be completely burned up. For every grain offering for the priest shall be completely burned up. It shall not be eaten. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "Speak to Aaron and to his sons. This is the law of the sin offering. In the plate," I'm really starting to believe I wrote down the wrong chapter. It'd help if I was in the right book. I am in Leviticus, not Numbers. Hence my confusion. Numbers, chapter 6, verse 20. This is going to make a lot more sense in about 3 seconds. Yeah. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, this is how you will bless the children of Israel." Hence why I titled it, "The Lord Gives the Blessing to the Children of Israel." This makes a lot more sense now. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, This is how you will bless the children of Israel, saying to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. They shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. This was a very special blessing that was being offered by God to the people of Israel. It was one to showcase that these were God's chosen people, that this was God's, essentially his firstborn, to look at it in that kind of mentality, that this was the one that God chose to honor all nations with and through. In the next chapter, now this is correct, I know, chapter 7, verse 89, you have Moses speaking to God in the tabernacle while God is on the mercy seat. And that is a beautiful showcase. God is fulfilling the contract that he had with Israel, that he would come down and rest on the mercy seat and before the face of Moses. And this is a beautiful section where it actually occurs. It's just one note that you could put there. And then in chapter 9, and I wouldn't mind reading this too, in chapter 9, verse 9 through 14, we've talked about the Passover. I'm sure that you remember it from our time in Leviticus. The Passover was established to be a memorial of what the Lord did for the children of Israel. But in Numbers chapter 9, verses 9 through 14, there's I don't want to call it an addendum, but if you go back and read what we read in Leviticus versus what we're about to read now, you might notice a slight shift. And there's a grand significance to the shift. In chapter 9 of Numbers 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If any man among you or of your posterity is unclean because of a dead body, or is far off on a journey, he will still keep the Passover of the Lord. Now notice, that's major in just of itself. If he is ceremonially unclean because he has had to touch a dead body, or is away from the camp on a journey, took business, had to go run an errand, whatever. He's away from the camp on a long journey, or is even ceremonially unclean due to the contact of a dead body, he will still keep the Passover. And that's huge, but it gets bigger. The 14th day of the second month at evening, they will keep it and eat with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs, everything that we've heard before. They will leave none of it until the morning, nor break any of its bones, according to the ordinances of the Passover. So it's even a reference back here saying, you've heard this, you know what to do. They will keep it. They will keep it. But the man who is ceremonially clean and is not on a journey and fails to keep the Passover, even that same person will be cut off from his people because he did not bring the offering of the Lord at its appointed time. That man will bear his sin. There's a focus here over the heart. He's saying this ceremonially clean individual who doesn't participate in the Passover, doesn't participate in the memorial to the Lord, that doesn't bring that offering unto God, he will be cut off, even though he's quote-unquote ceremonially clean. And then in verse 14, if a stranger. Now, let's change that to the word we use today. If an immigrant. That would be the word we would use today. If an immigrant will sojourn among you and keep the Passover to the Lord, according to the ordinance of the Passover that was previously established, according to the manner of it, so he will do, you will have one ordinance both for the resident alien, the immigrant, the stranger, and for the natural-born citizen of the land. What this passage is saying about the Passover, let me say it differently. Whosoever will may come. If the stranger is among you and desires to participate, if they are willing to keep the ordinance as it has been distributed, as it has been given, as I have declared it, then they are welcome to join. There's some folks that paint God in a negative light when they view it in the Old Testament. They say God was cruel. He only cared for Israel. He didn't care about other people. No, we have this passage right here signifying that he said, if someone wants to come in and accept the law, accept the commandments, accept the statutes that I have set forth, anyone may come and be a part of Israel. And there'll be no difference here. In what is the most pinnacle moment when they're showcasing God's grace, he said if it's a resident person, if it's a natural born citizen, or if it's one of these new immigrants, a stranger in the land, you come across a camp in your journeys, and they say, who are you people? And then you say, we're the people of Israel. We're the children of Israel. And I say, well, what God do you serve? We serve Jehovah God. And they say, well, I want to serve that God. And you say, well, you got to keep all these things. And they said, that I will do. Here's our customs. That I'll keep. Here's the Passover. What is that? Let me explain it to you. God brought us out of Egypt. He passed over whosoever offered the blood on the doorpost, and God perceived that and protected us. You got to do that too. I wasn't in Egypt. I know, but you got to do that too. Okay. And they submitted and surrendered to God's ordinances, his commands. They were welcomed. God has always been an all-welcoming God. The same God today. Whosoever will may come. If they want to join in, they can. But there's only one way in, that's keeping the commandments. They must take upon them the image of God on them. Because remember, Israel was supposed to be the image of God. So they showed up and said, I want to be like Israel. I want to put upon myself then the image of God. And he said, whosoever will can. Let them. So this is a beautiful passage because what was said in Leviticus was expanded, not that it was never intended to be kept solely by Israel, but God was clarifying and saying, don't get to this pot where you think, oh, well, you weren't born an Israelite, so you got to go over there while we participate in our little custom. No, that's not the point. It's not to be exclusionary. It's to be inclusionary. And God wanted to set that difference among them. So yeah, that's the first third of the book. The census and these laws being rekept and reapplied to the Levites. And then we move to that first minor unit. And I'm only saying minor. I want to make this clear. I say major because it was 10 chapters. I say minor because it's 3 chapters, 2.5 chapters. It's not minor because it lacks detail or lacks significance or lacks importance. It's minor simply because it's small. So if you want to maybe scratch out major and minor and put larger and smaller unit, that's fine too. And you'll see that carried out throughout the rest of the outline. But the first smaller unit and the minor unit, number 1, you have from Numbers chapter 10, halfway through the chapter roughly, in verse 11 through chapter 11. So the back half of chapter 10 and all of chapter 11, and what we have there is Israel complaining. Now, if you read your Old Testament enough, you'll find that's a common theme, especially during the wilderness journey. They complain a lot. You can see there, that's over 35 verses of them just complaining. Moses did his best to try to come to them, to bring peace to them, but they still complained. They still were dissatisfied with the position they were in. They were not being gracious to the Lord. They were not being thankful. They were being selfish. And you can go and read those chapters. And then, in chapter 12, the disease of complaining crept all the way to the top, I guess is how I want to word it. That's not how I want to say it, but that's how I want to word it. The stench of complaints rose to the top. So much so that after after Moses has lost his wife, he remarried. And just like, some of you might relate more to this than I care for you too. But after Moses' wife passed away, he said, I want to get remarried. remarries, and then his family complains about who he married. They said, you shouldn't have married that woman. And Moses said, oh, really? And God said, oh, really? Because he smote Miriam with leprosy. And if that's not a clear answer about who's right and who's wrong, it's who walks away with leprosy is probably the one in the wrong. And that's exactly what happened. That Aaron and Miriam, his sister, were like, Moses, we don't like what you did. And Moses said, I've done nothing wrong. And God said, here, I'll prove it. And smote Miriam with leprosy. So that's chapter 12. She was healed. They repented. Aaron freaked out. Miriam obviously freaked out. She then became ceremonially unclean and physically unclean. So they had to acknowledge that, carried her outside the camp, did what God obeyed. She was healed and restored. But this was just a moment of God making it clear that Moses is still honored. And what he did was honored. And there was to be no rebuttal of it. But yeah, that was chapter 12. That even Aaron and what?
There's only two people that were like cleansed of leprosy in the whole entire Bible.
In the Old Testament, yes, ma'am. And Miriam was one, and it was a cursing of God that was uniquely ascribed. The other one we talked about wasn't even an Israelite. It was a Syrian. And with the working with the prophet, dipping in Jordan, which is a very dirty river, he was made clean. And that's why it was so odd when Jesus came on the scene and there was multiple lepers being cleansed, when that was not something that was common or accustomed to being seen throughout Israel. Because there only had been two. One was a woman when the law was being given that was smitten by God to receive leprosy, and the other one wasn't even a Jew. He was of outside origin and was not subject to the laws of Moses as the men who were cleansed, the women who were cleansed in the time of Jesus. So yes, thank you for bringing that up again. This is a person that was smitten with leprosy that was cured, but in a more divinely set aside sense. Yes, and his name escapes me because I had it for the last session, but the Syrian was cured, but he was not subject to the laws of Moses like an Israelite would have been. So, but thank you for bringing that up again. Yeah, this was a very unique instance in Numbers chapter 12. Any other comment or question before we get to the second unit? Before we do this, it was touched upon in the map there about the orientation of the camp. And it was done so with purpose. There was 3 tribes set to each cardinal direction of the camp. 3 to the north, 3 to the south, 3 to the east, and 3 to the west. And what is beautiful about the orientation is that when you go through and read how they were laid out, and this is happening in the first 4 chapters, you have Judah due east. Now, we can recall that. We know Judah's special, line of the tribe of Judah. This is the tribe in which Jesus stemmed from. His ancestry was given. We see that he is furthest east, which is the direction they were trying to travel. There is some unique significance to that. I don't want to get too in-depth to it because there's more to be said on it than I want to give time to it tonight. But there was purpose in their direction. And Judah was given due east, and that wasn't done by accident, is what I'm trying to say. That there was purpose in Judah being the forefront of Israel. It was all symbolic of what was to come. And I wanted to touch on that. That'll be your 5th question, and you can really dig into that. And we'll go over those more in a couple weeks. So, all right, major unit 2 is the wilderness of Paran. The wilderness of Paran, and we get into some content that you may be familiar with, because in chapters 13 and 14, we have the 12 spies going out into the land of Canaan. You had these 12 men, one selected of each tribe, and they were sent out to scout the land, and this is a fun little note to put in your pocketbook. They were in the land of Canaan spying out for 40 days and 40 nights. It's funny how that number keeps coming up, right? They were in the land searching for 40 days. They came back to give their report. And we have the 10 who said, nope, they're too big. They're giants in the land. There's no way we could go in. Don't get us wrong. The land is beautiful. It's filled with abundance. It's proverbially flowing with milk and honey. It is rich, and it is a place to be desired. But there's no way that we can conquer the inhabitants. At first, Caleb stands up and says to the camp of Israel, do not listen to these men. The Lord is on our side. We can take them. And that's chapter 13, Caleb standing up to say, we can do it. Chapter 14, Joshua joins Caleb. Not to say Joshua was ever against Caleb. Chapter 13, though, we have Caleb standing up alone. Chapter 14 starts with Moses and Joshua on behalf of God, lamenting and praying alongside Caleb, and they're all working together saying, we've got to do this, we should do this. And then we know what happens next. Israel collectively says no. God punishes them. They say, okay, we'll go do it, but it's too late. God says, don't go. They go anyway. They lose the fight and come whimpering back and say, why couldn't we do it? And they're having to be told, because once you made the initial decision to rebuke God's direction, God changed directions, but you continued to be hard-headed and not listen. When God said go, you didn't. And when God said don't, you did. And that brought upon punishment both times. And that's chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 15, the laws are reaffirmed because that is a common theme. We've done it a lot already just in the first part of Deuteronomy. But the laws had to keep being reaffirmed because they kept being ignored. I feel like this is the highway that there's a speed limit sign on every 30 feet because it's like people keep forgetting. So we're going to keep posting and making sure, hopefully, that they'll finally listen. Put enough cars out there, cop signs on the side, maybe they will. They do be sounding like that. They sound like a toddler at times. It's like, how many times do I have to tell you? Don't stick your finger in the light socket. But they keep doing it. Yeah, it's if anyone has kids, it's funny how like, man, this seems like a very specific time in their life. Either a toddler or a teenager, depending on how stubborn they were whenever they were. No further comment on that. Numbers chapter 16 through 19. We get into I don't want to say dark time, but it was definitely a time filled with tragedy. There was a collection of individuals. It was headed up and led by a man named Korah, and two men with him. I want to pronounce their names correctly: Dotham, and like I said, hang on. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. It's really close to Abraham, and I don't want to say Abraham because that just gets confusing. But it's Korah, who was a descendant of Levi, and that's where there's major importance with that. And then Dathan, because Nathan wasn't available, I guess, and Abiram, which were descendants of Reuben. They began to lead this opposition against Moses. And it could have been from a great place in their hearts, but I don't think it was. Korah essentially stands up and says, Moses has taken way too much on himself. He can't lead all of these people. There's just too many, and it just will not work. We have to help Moses. And what seems to be the underlying mentality behind it is because Korah wanted the power, and that's explained in chapter 16 through 19 because of how God dealt with Korah. It wasn't like, Moses, it looks like you need help. Can I be a good friend and help you out? It was more like, Moses, you're doing too much. Give me your job. And essentially this uprising took place. Korah, his two closest minions, and literally hundreds of other people were like, look, Moses, time's up. You need to pass the torch. You need to move on. And Moses said, Let's let God decide. I love that Moses didn't immediately say, no, it's me, go away. He said, if you think so, let the Lord decide. And it clearly, and I'm going to summarize this a little fast paced, it clearly became that Moses was one that still God had selected. Moses and Aaron were still the ones God had chosen. Both Moses to lead the nation, but also Aaron and his children, who were of the tribe of Levi. And again, this is why it's important. Korah was of the tribe of Levi. He was saying, look, we've been called to minister to the tabernacle. You just have Aaron and his sons being the priest. We could do that too. I'm of the tribe of Levi. There's nothing holding me back. Me and my sons could do it. Me and my family could take over and help and be the priest and do the job. We could lead. We could do everything that you're doing. And we got enough people here to help. 200, I think, and 55 people, if I'm not mistaken. We still have hundreds of people, though, that were willing to help. And we could all do this. And they said, well, let's let the Lord decide. And God chose the same people He had chosen all along. Moses and Aaron. And then you get to chapter 17, verse 8, and just one verse, because it's really one continuous story. But in Numbers 17, verse 8, you see how God chose. Because they had these men all present a rod, and they wrote their names on it. And I love this. This is just how simple and primitive, yet primitive this was. They all presented a rod for the tribe. They wrote their names on the rod, and Moses said, whoever God chooses will know because it'll bud. And the next day, Aaron's rod had budded, which we've heard the rod that budded, right? We've heard that account. This is the significance. God was re-emphasizing again, I have chosen Aaron. I have chosen this lineage. I have chosen these people. I have chosen this to be the priesthood. And his rod was put in the Ark of the Covenant alongside the commandments and the pot of manna. Those were the three items that were put inside of the Ark of the Covenant. God's symbolism and seal saying, this is whom I have chosen. I have chosen Aaron and his sons and their descendants to be my priesthood. And it's full proof. This dead rod was brought to life. Because you got to think about that. That rod was not going to bud on its own. It was not going to sprout branches. It was not going to sprout flowers. It was not going to be pollinated. It was not going to bear fruit or seeds or almonds, whatever you want to call it, overnight without it being a divine miracle. And that's exactly what happened. They all essentially presented their sticks, and one of them sprouted. And God used that to showcase that this is the man that I've chosen. This is what I have declared. And for punishment, Moses said, I want to make sure this is unique so you know, again, that this is the Lord. These men, if God is against them, will not die a natural death. The earth will swallow them. So if you do not want to die with them, you should probably move away from their tents. Those that chose to move away did. Those that chose to stay, along with their families, chose to stay. And the earth opened up and swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, all of their families and all of their possessions. It was just like the earth split in two. Everything that was against the Lord fell in, and the earth closed back up. And that's pretty cut and dry. Moses said, who God has chosen, his rod will bud, Aaron's bud. Who's against the Lord will be swallowed by the earth. And these families that stood up against were swallowed by the earth. And I can only imagine that the rest of Israel had to stand there. And if they really wanted to despise Moses still, they had to blind their eyes to so much, and they did. We're not going to get to it tonight. We're kind of running short, this is kind of where I want to get to, is the second unit. In 20 and 21, we have this account there in 21, and I'm going to spend more time on that next time because I've got a rabbit hole that I purposely want to take you all down. Because I have fixated on it for weeks now, and I can't get off of it, and I love it, and it's mysterious, and I don't have all the answers, and I just want to confuse you too and say Merry Christmas and send you on your way. But in chapter 21, we have this same rebellion of the people. We have them rebelling again, despite everything that God has chosen to show them again. They still choose, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to turn my blind eye. I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to look to myself. I'm going to take what I want. And God said, well, here we go again. Toddler, you're sticking your hand back, you're back into the socket, and I've got to pull you away and cover it up again. And it's really hard to read some of this because I have to remember that I do this same thing to the Lord. I'm this continuous, hard-headed, stubborn rebellion at times, and God has to pull me away at times and go, look, you're doing the same thing that you've done before, and you've got to stop. We've got to start over. Let's reaffirm some things. Let's start fresh, and let's try to move forward. And that's the story of relationships. You love, you make mistakes, you grow. Interesting notes, though, from this second chapter, or second set of major chapters. In chapter 14, verse 11, God literally just asked the question, how long will these people despise me? And that's a hard statement from the Lord. How long will these people despise me? In chapter 15, verse 37 through 41, so I'm so glad that this is here now. I've got this, and I'll call it an annoying bracelet because you see that part that hangs off. I'm not cutting it off for a reason. We just got these bracelets. They're not anything special. They're just representative of the tassels that would be worn on the garments. And they're supposed to be getting in the way. They're supposed to be annoying. They're supposed to stand out because they're supposed to be reminders. And all those tassels that would get hung up on everything because they were like this, but if it just hung straight, and it's not going to hang straight off my wrist otherwise. But it would hang like that and get in the way and get wrapped up and get in the water. And when you're trying to clean a diaper, it gets in the diaper, then you got to go wash it off. They wore these tassels, and these tassels were explained in chapter 15, the purpose of the tassels in the garments. They were to be reminders. They were to be just that constant, ever-present, I am to be separate, I am to be different. I've already read to you chapter 17, verse 8, the budding of Aaron's rod. And like I said, I encourage you to read those passages too. Maybe take time this week. That's 19 chapters so far to really go through. If you do 3 a day between now and next Sunday, you just have to read one next Sunday, and we'll be caught up to chapter 20 is where we'll start next week. Any questions, though, in the book of Numbers before we go anywhere else, or what we've covered before we close? And so you bring that up. I found this, and it's just going to be printed out for everyone. It's not going to be something I'm going to force you to memorize or study. We've talked about chiasms a lot, the arrows. There's one that I found and I looked into and I read it back and forth that goes from chapter 10, verse 11, which is where we split in the first major unit, through chapter 21, verse 20, which is almost where we end in the second minor unit. So from minor unit 1 to essentially minor unit 2, all of that has this arrowhead style, and it points to the center where Aaron's rod comes to life. That was the focal point of from chapter 10 to chapter 21, essentially. And you can see the comparisons from chapter 10 to chapter 21. I'm just going to have that printed out on the paper, and I've got it laid out where the A's go together, the B's go together, and there's indents, so you can kind of keep track of it. And it's going to be printed out. And something for you to study, so you can see how there was this focal point of like this sandwich, because food, right? There's this sandwich where it's an even layer on the bottom and an even layer on top. And what's in the middle is the most important. And I don't like to overemphasize some of these things, but I just wanted to share them with you because I find them interesting. I find how often they occur to be something you can't overlook. And because it's a literary style. And so that's going to be included. I've got the source and everything. It'll be all typed up on your papers too. But next week, we'll go through the next part of the book of Numbers, or we'll finish surveying the book of Numbers. And if we have time, we'll begin answering questions. If not, 2 weeks from now, we'll go over the answers to our questions and finalize our study on the book of Numbers. So kind of a 3-week plan that I hope to stick with, depending on the book. Deuteronomy may be a little different. I don't know fully how I'm going to do that since we're studying it on Sunday morning. We may blitz through that one. I don't know. But after Deuteronomy, it depends on the book, because some of them get short and we won't have as much content to cover. So it may just be 2 weeks for a book, and then we may have to have a break or something, which we have some things on our calendar that are going to chop up a little bit. Some of our Old Testament study, like on the 4th when we have revival services, we obviously won't be having Old Testament survey, which, man, I just realized you'll have 2 weeks to answer your questions, because if we get the rest of our questions next week, that following week is revival, so it'll be 3 weeks. Man, I had that so beautiful, and then the snow hit. Do you see what happens? Yes. Should. Oh, they love it. All right. Anything else before we close? Amen. If not, we'll close with more prayer. Again, remember those prayer requests we mentioned this morning, especially Miss Sandra. I talked to Miss Tricia this afternoon, and nothing's better. They're going to have to. They're waiting to do an MRI and hopefully get that done tomorrow. But